The early 90s was an interesting time for consoles and video games in general, as we would see a lot of heavy hitters and very popular and iconic franchises be brought to life. But we would also see many arcade ports and interesting titles that would often be bundled into packages, like we can see here, to bring more eyes onto games that were popular but obviously at some point didn't sell as well as they should have done. But they would have been great additions to anyone's collection. And in many cases, if you were after some of these games, trying to find individual copies might have been a tough break, but it would have been easier to play them or access them through these collections. And for all intents and purposes, the majority of us would have only played these games for the first time ever because of these bundles. We would probably have never heard of them only for that. So here we are going to be taking a look at the third entry in the Mega Game series that will consist of, again, 3 games, all from different categories, but these ones are all based off of arcade ports that were popular on the Mega Drive itself, that range from shooting to racing and a beat 'em up. If you've seen the previous videos that I've covered already with Mega Games 1 and 2, you should also check them out, as there is a varying mix of different types of games that will appeal to a whole wide audience of players. So if you're interested to see what more of this collection offers, then there's no time like the present. To start off this list, we will be looking at Super Thunderblade, which is a combat flight simulation shooter game that was developed and published by Sega themselves for the Mega Drive, releasing in Japan in 1988, later in North America in 1989, and then in Europe in 1990. The game would also see a subsequent port on the Sega Master System, where you take control of a well-equipped helicopter, which is used to attack groups of guerrillas and other enemies, where you will have to shoot guns and missiles at opponents in order to destroy them. You will also come up against variants of different types of bosses and other gameplay styles the further into each level that you get, where it'll move as like a scrolling shooter at the start, almost in a third person view, and then it will go into like a top down view later on in the levels for the boss fights. The Mega Drive version does take elements from the arcade original, although it is scaled down drastically in order to allow it to run on the console efficiently. And if you're familiar with other arcade style games, even other console games of this generation, you might be familiar of the gameplay style being very similar to the earlier Space Harrier, one of Sega's original arcade classics that would also be very popular on the Mega Drive and even on the Master System itself. And like many others, this game would also be ported to other consoles as part of bundles and collections, along with this Mega Games 3 collection that we would see over the years. And as a result, the game did receive fairly decent reviews across the board, but did state that the game is quite tough, especially the further into it that you get. But you do have the ability to change various option settings from the menu, where you can change the difficulty and you can also increase your life count so you can prolong the experience. But as with any of these games, with a little bit of luck and a little bit of skill, the more you play it, the better you'll get. And it is generally a fun experience, and it can be quite addictive once you start to see some progress in it. It is definitely a worthwhile and solid addition to this list. While it is one of the earliest games to be released on the Mega Drive, it definitely holds its place as being part of this collection, which I definitely recommend that you try. Super Monaco Grand Prix is a Formula 1 racing simulation video game that was released by Sega originally in the arcade in 1989 that would see ports follow on home consoles with the Mega Drive and Master System in the early 90s. The game acts as a sequel and somewhat of a reimagining of the earlier 1979 game simply known as Monaco Grand Prix, which consists of an arcade mode and a Grand Prix mode so that you can play through an entire championship that will take you across many different locations over the Formula 1 season, where you'll play on familiar tracks at the time in Japan with the Suzuka circuit, also San Marino, Brazil and other countries. The game would vary differently in terms of its visual appearance compared to the arcade version, but even more so with the Master System or 8-bit ports. My first introduction to this series was on the Master System itself at the age of 10 when we got our first console that was packaged along with Sonic the Hedgehog and the Master Games 1 collection, and as part of that game you had World Soccer, Columns and Super Monaco Grand Prix for the 8-bit edition, and it was a very different experience. It was a lot faster and more frantic and it was very, very difficult. But one of the unique features was the 2-player mode with that game, where you could play in split screen with some of your friends, and you can pretty much do the same in this game as well. The game would also be released on other systems and home computers with the Atari ST, Amstrad CPC, Commodore 64 and ZX Spectrum. Each version of the game would differ in terms of its visual presentation to cope with the limitations of the console's hardware. But in the Mega Drive version, it takes elements from the arcade, where it sees you as the racer sitting inside of the cockpit of the car, where all you can see is the steering wheel and the arms of the driver being able to move the steering wheel around, and you see the front of the wheels. But it does limit your view somewhat because a lot of the racing surfaces that you end up on are mainly flat, and when the map transitions into like corners or hairpins or even quick turns where you have to dart left and right very, very quickly, they can also throw you off, because more often than not, if you're carrying too much speed into a corner, you will fly off the track, and there's always some sort of hurdle or obstacle that's always standing in the way on the corner, so you can guarantee if you hit it, and especially if you hit the wheel, you will destroy the whole suspension and it will be race over and you'll have to start all over again. So the game is challenging in that respect, but regardless of which version of the game that you play, it is a very, very tough game. The AI opponents always seem to have an edge or an upper hand against you, and you're always crawling and lagging behind in order to try and keep up with them. You almost have to have a near perfect race in order to have any chance of even getting into one of the top positions, and if you make any sort of mistake at all, you will end up at the back of the pack pretty much, and that's as good as game over in most respects. And it's the same across all versions. Even on the easiest difficulty, the game is still very, very tough, and even with the different gear ratio settings with the transmission, you can set it to automatic, or you can have 4-speed manual or 7-speed manual, but there is actually varying differences in terms of the overall speed that you can get out of each car, because if you go with automatic, I find that you're always limited to a certain speed. I even found that with the Master System edition, and it's no different here with the Mega Drive version. But if you go into the manual settings, you can push the car even more and get more speed out of it. Mind you just have to be mindful of knowing when to change up and down through the gears when approaching corners. But it's like everything else, as in with practice, it will gradually improve over time. Now, it won't be for everybody. These games are very, very tough, and they probably will be frustrating for a lot of players, but they're not too bad to play in quick bursts in all respects to it. But even saying that, at the time of release, the game did get solid reviews across all systems it did release on, because it had enough elements both of arcade and even simulation practices that could appeal to different types of players. If you wanted to play it casually, or if you wanted to be more hands-on with it, you definitely had that option. And for all intents and purposes, for its time, it was one of the best racing games seen on any platform, as it was definitely one of the most authentic that you could find anywhere. But overall, it's not a bad title. It's a solid racer. It is very difficult. It is very reflective of its time, but it's one of those games that you just will need to put time and effort in and have a little bit of patience to get anything out of it. Alien Storm is a popular beat-em-up shooter, originally released in the arcade by Sega in 1990, where it was later ported to both the Mega Drive and Master System in 1991, that sees a race of homicidal aliens invading Earth, and the only thing that stands between them from dominating the world is a team of special forces, which you can choose from in the game, and they all have their own distinctive characteristics and abilities that you can use to dispose of the alien threat. As it's a beat-em-up, one of the unique aspects is its co-op features, very similar to games like Streets of Rage and Golden Axe, that were also extremely popular on Sega consoles of the time. And this game, along with all of those other titles that I've mentioned, managed to see re-releases on modern consoles over the years, usually being packaged as part of bundles, with a collection of other games that were also high sellers among Sega's massive catalogue of games. The game is a mixture of different missions in which you can complete, and there are several additional missions on the console versions with additional bonus stages that you need to complete in order to acquire resources for your weapons to aid in progression. And the difficulty does increase because the enemies become faster and stronger and take more damage the further into the game that you get. Very like normal beat 'em ups, the further you go the more challenging it becomes. And the game was met with fairly decent reviews on systems, mainly on consoles, with it being comparable to games like Golden Axe and Streets of Rage. Although I will admit from my own experience playing this game growing up, while it is a solid title in its own right and it's worthy of being added to this collection, if I'll be brutally honest, it does lack in many ways compared to both Golden Axe and especially Streets of Rage, which I consider the first two Streets of Rage games essentially to be the greatest beat 'em ups on the Sega Mega Drive in all respects. Now others may disagree with me on that, and that's totally fine, but I put a lot more time into those games, so I just find that the whole gameplay aesthetic and how it feels just is a step up compared to a lot of these other titles. But that's not to say that these other games are bad, they're not. They're really good solid titles, but they will appeal to a different style of audience. But the fact is that they have beat 'em up elements in them will definitely appeal to fans of that genre. The arcade version of the game was also voted among the top 25 beat 'em ups of all time, only in recent years. So that will give you a clear idea as to how a lot of these older titles are still considered even popular even to the current day. And there are some differences between both the Mega Drive and the Master System versions. While you do have 3 characters to choose from, the Master System only has 2 of the characters, and it doesn't have as many levels to play through. But still, if you're a Master System owner of the time, it would have been a worthwhile title to pick up also. But overall, it's a solid game and is a worthy addition to this list. The Mega Games 3 collection presented some interesting titles, all varying in different qualities, again being arcade ports, that were considered at its time of release to be one of the most popular and well received games on the platform. But for whatever reason, many of these games were simply just lost to time on the console as it got older. So the best way to get access to them, or even to be introduced to them for the first time, was because of this particular collection. While the games are solid and are reflective of their time, this entry wouldn't be the strongest point in the series. That would come in the form of Mega Games 2, which I have covered previously. There'll be a link in the description, where you had massive icons and heavy hitters on the Sega console with Golden Axe, Streets of Rage and The Revenge of Shinobi, 3 of the greatest games ever on 16-bit consoles. So for all intents and purposes, that in itself was a hard act to follow, and in many ways for most of us players growing up, that usually at the time was always seen as the definitive collection among the Mega Games series, and it still pretty much is to this day. But it doesn't take away from all of the games games in this list across all of the videos. 9 games in total, they all present something different, and it is an interesting take on what Sega were thinking of back then. It was a great way to sell more games, it was a great way to introduce players to different franchises, and really just a good idea to repackage games that had somewhat become sidelined as time went on. But they all produced something interesting. Whether you liked puzzles, soccer, racing, shooting, beat 'em ups, action adventure, the series had it all, in fairness. And if anything, it was a great addition to your collection, because if you had these series within your collection, you would usually always be the popular one among your mates in school, as they always presented a different talking point, where more players could get involved in each of the experiences, often to a point that you'd have mates calling around to your house or you would go around to theirs, just to play these games on these collections, as the majority of them also had co-op or 2-player elements, so you could have great fun with your mates. And in all honesty, that was really the appealing factor of each of these collections, was with its multiplayer features. So if you haven't played these games in a while, or if you've yet to go back and play them, I highly recommend that you do. There really is something there for everybody. While some of these packages aren't as good as others, they still will appeal to different players, so you will find something that you like. But with that being said, Sega also did produce many other unique bundles and catalogue specific games from not just the Mega Drive but other systems that we need to dive into further, which this next video will provide, that will look at even more interesting games that were often bundled as part of massive collections, even on later systems.